Hello, friends. Today I am going to tell you some facts about the use of salt and why the low consumption of salt can shorten our life. We are all guided by the recommendations of the World Health Organization, which urges people to consume no more than 2 grams of sodium per day compared to the usual table salt. It's 5 grams. And in accordance with these recommendations, in principle, doctors work in the whole civilized world. In accordance with these recommendations, I live and all my conscious life. I tried to limit the use of salt in my diet, up to the point that I don't have salt in the kitchen at all, as a class. For a long time, it was believed that a person is sufficient with the salt that he consumes with ordinary food products. I mean bread, potatoes, cereals, meat, that is, what we eat in everyday life. Why did such an attitude to salt arise at all? The fact is that high consumption of salt is associated with an increase in blood pressure. This is a proven fact, since the salt, or rather the sodium contained in it, contributes to the retention of fluid in the body, increases the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, increases the sensitivity of the vessels to adrenaline and noradrenaline, and, accordingly, as the volume of circulating fluid increases, so do the vessels shrink. 5 grams of the brewed salt per day, or 2 grams of sodium. The logic behind this is that if we consume less salt, it leads to the fact that people's blood pressure will not increase, the risk of developing hypertension will disappear, and since the risk of developing hypertonia will disappear, the risk of developing cardiovascular disease will also disappear. Consequently, the reduction of consumption of salt. In Japan, residents consume a large amount of salt, much more than residents, for example, of the United States. And at the same time, the duration of life in Japan is longer, and the frequency of cardiovascular diseases is less than in the United States. There is a certain gap. If the connection between the consumption of salt and increased blood pressure is proven, the connection between the consumption of salt and mortality from cardiovascular diseases is a purely speculative hypothesis. We know that in evidence-based medicine, everything needs to be checked in randomized clinical studies, or at least in large epidemiological observations. And so, an attempt was made, which began several years ago, a rural epidemiologic study. About 225,000 people from 27 countries participate in this study. And just recently, in 2018, The Lancet magazine published intermediate data for the first time in August. And these data were so contradictory that they caused a lot of confusion, slop of criticism by many famous cardiological associations. But nevertheless, facts are facts. The data that was published reached 1,000 people. These are people from 35 to 75 years old, absolutely young. It reflects very well the amount of sodium that a person consumes with food. And that's what they found out. They divided people into 3 groups. In the first group, the average consumption of salt was 1 grams per day. In the second group, the average consumption of salt per day was 75 grams. And in the third group, the amount of salt consumed was 38 grams. This is the average value per day. And in the first group, with the least amount of salt consumed per day, there was a higher number of fatal cardiovascular diseases and general disease level of heart diseases. In the second, moderate consumption of salt, there was no connection between consumption of salt and disease of heart diseases at all. And finally, in the third group, in this experiment, we measure the probability of increasing the number of cardiovascular diseases, but there is no indication of increasing the number of cardiovascular diseases. In all the studies I have published, if we draw the graph, the probability of increasing the number of cardiovascular diseases and the amount of salt used in the solution, the graph turns out to represent the English letter J. That is, a low salt consumption led to an increase in mortality. An average salt consumption produced the lowest mortality, and a high salt consumption. Accumulation of leukocytosis is a little bit higher. And it's so high that it's possible not to expose to it. In these researches, all people ate salt in much higher quantity. This is recommended by the WHO. In the group of people with the lowest amount of salt, people ate 1 grams of salt per day. And as we remember, 5 grams per day is the recommended case of leukocytosis, which should be pursued according to the guidelines of the World Health Organization. I remind again that these studies were concerning people with normal blood pressure and healthy people. Many refused to take this study as serious. Critics criticized the authors, but nevertheless, you can't go anywhere. In general, that is, research is indeed carried out in 27 countries, on a huge number of people, different regions, different populations, different food habits, different races of people are involved. Salt in much higher quantity. This is recommended by the WHO. In the group of people with the lowest amount of salt, people ate 1 grams of salt per day. And as we remember, 5 grams per day is the recommended case of leukocytosis, which should be pursued according to the guidelines of the World Health Organization. I remind again that these studies were concerning people with normal blood pressure and healthy people. Many refused to take this study as serious. Critics criticized the authors, but nevertheless, you can't go anywhere. In general, that is, research is indeed carried out in 27 countries, on a huge number of people, different regions, different populations, different food habits, different races of people are involved, and everywhere the same results are obtained. And since there was criticism of this work, the journal Hypertension in April 2019 published another work, which also aimed to identify the relationship between the use of salt and the frequency of the development of cardiovascular diseases very much, and increased blood pressure. This study observed people for 7 years. The number of people tested was 457,000. The average age of those tested was 56 years. These were also healthy people, without heart attacks, without hypertension, without diabetes, and so on. Interestingly, in this study, there was no correlation at all between the use of salt and the frequency of cardiovascular diseases and mortality from them. The results of this study also, in general, somehow refuted our belief that high salt consumption always poses risks for the cardiovascular system. What mechanisms can explain that the decrease in salt consumption? It causes an increase in the frequency of cardiovascular diseases and even leads to a higher mortality rate. It is believed that a decrease in the concentration of sodium in the blood causes the activation of the glomerular system of the kidneys. The glomerular system of the kidneys is a cell that produces renin. Renin is a ferment, which affects the angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is a protein that is produced in the liver. It circulates in the blood in an inactive form. As soon as we activate renin, in particular sodium, renin immediately turns the angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 then turns into angiotensin 2. Thank you very much. Participation in the transformation of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2 is taken by the angiotensin-converting enzyme. The angiotensin-converting enzyme is found in the lungs. Under the influence of the angiotensin-converting enzyme, the concentration of angiotensin 2 increases, and angiotensin 2 already affects the adrenal glands. Under the influence of angiotensin A2, the production of aldosterone increases. That is, the so-called renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is triggered. And our body is arranged in such a way that the activation of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone systems. It leads to the change of the walls of the vessels, to the formation of atherosclerotic glands, to remodeling. That is, to change the shape of the heart, to disrupt the relaxation of the heart, to increase the tone of the vessels. The activation of the adenine-angiotensin-aldosterone system significantly increases the risk for health. That is why reducing the consumption of salt, paradoxically activating the adenine-angiotensin-aldosterone system, is so important. Transcription by ESO. Translation by of cardiovascular disease. The change of the idea of the role of salt consumption and the development of cardiovascular diseases and the risks for life has appeared as a result of a recent study. This study is still in progress, and we will monitor the progress of these studies. What conclusions can be drawn on the basis of these data? The WHO norm, which recommends eating as little salt as possible, less than 5 grams per day, it can lead to the fact that we ourselves can increase the risks for our lives. I think that if you eat 1 teaspoon of salt per day, that is 7 grams. Thank you for listening till the end. See you next time.